Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 4 of the Leadership Alliance Professional Development Workshop Series. My name is Dr. Taiese Bingham-Hickman, Executive Director of the Leadership Alliance, and I will be the moderator for this evening's event. This event is a component of the Leadership Alliance Virtual Professional Development Series. The Leadership Alliance Executive Office and its partners created this initiative to ensure continuity of skill building, networking, and exposure to graduate programs for undergraduate and graduate students. Paired with our Wednesday evening workshops, we hope to expose you to a discussion of critical issues, allow you to network with each other and our wonderful doctoral scholars, as well as develop learning approaches and skills for navigating your research careers. This evening, I'm pleased to introduce doctoral scholar, Dr. Edwina Ashie-Nikoi. Dr. Ashie-Nikoi is a historian and archivist, currently appointed lecturer in the Department of Information Studies at the University of Ghana. She is affiliated with Ghana's Institute of African Studies as editorial coordinator of its contemporary Journal of African Studies. Dr. Ashie-Nikoi earned her BA in history from Spelman College and her PhD in history in the African diaspora from New York University, where she had spent 3 summers conducting research as a Leadership Alliance SR-EIP participant. After earning her PhD, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Virginia's Carter G. Woodson Center for African and African-American Studies, and then worked as an archivist in the Manuscripts, Archives, and Rare Books Division of the Schoenberg Center for Research in Black Culture. She is interested in how culture and history are remembered, documented, and represented in African and African diasporan cultural systems. She credits the scholarly interest in the Pan-African and African diasporan experience to her childhood in Dubai, United Arab Emirates, where family, friends, and acquaintances hailed from across the African continent and the Caribbean. Her work addresses Black archival traditions and memory work, decolonizing archival knowledge and practice, and alternative archives in Africa and its diaspora. Her current projects undertake Pan-African interrogations of the archive and consider archival activism, archival silence, and community archives in the African context. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. Yes, thank you. We have a number of questions from students who are, very interested in your work, and in particular, a few questions that came in about why you went into the research aspect of history. I know we have some humanities and social scientists with us this evening. So can you talk a little bit about that path and why you chose history?
Okay. So thank you, Dr. Bingham. So, my mom used to say, she used to ask if I was from the past, because I really loved history, even as a child. And so it seemed almost natural that I would pursue history as an academic, path. And so I sort of, I don't know, so in Ghana, in the high school system that I was a part of, you had to choose the subjects that you were going to do. And history was one of them. And so when I went to college, I continued with it against the wishes of my father. At one point, he threatened not to pay my fees because, he said, do something sensible. But I loved it. And I also had mentors, my lecturers at Spelman who were passionate about history, who, made history real in the present and who made the connections between the past and the present. And so for me, it became not just about, the past and events and peoples of the past, but it became something that really even helped to explain my present, helped to explain, the things going on around me, the events, just the politics, all of that. It helped to explain, it helped to make sense of it. And so, pursuing research in history was just one way that I felt like I could make sense of my world as a woman of African descent, a woman who grew up in a sense, in diaspora. I grew up in the Middle East amongst peoples, as you mentioned, from different parts of Africa and the African diaspora. So it just was a way that I could make sense of who I was, also sense of my social world, my cultural world, and just to explain the present. I feel like history is one way, really, is like if history was compulsory, let me put it that way. If history was a mandatory subject all across, like throughout one's college years, like everyone had to take one history course at least, I feel like a lot of the mess that we see in this world, we wouldn't see because, in, I forget which part of scripture this is, but it's these words attributed to King Solomon, that there's nothing new under the sun, right? So there's a lot of stuff that we see that are really repetitions, or that happened in the past. And so I feel like history has lessons for us. And so doing research in history was a way that I could learn from the past to make sense of my present and to move forward. Yeah.
Very interesting. And we had a student ask this question about something that was mentioned in your bio specific to archival activism and archival silence. So they said they'd not heard of it before reading your bio, and they want to know, since communicating the data from research is an important aspect of the scientific process, how can we as scientists be more conscious when sharing or publishing our findings so that Pan-African communities will always have access?
That's a great question. I think that there are a number of ways that we can do that. So I'm reminded of a colleague who did work on, so there's this like dump site in Accra that is that is worked upon by people that come from the north of Ghana mostly. And so he did work on just talking about waste, but then also sort of linking it to Ghana's sort of very fractured relationship with LGBTQ issues. And so one way that he felt like he could take his research to the people was that when the book was being launched in the States, he actually insisted that one of the deals that he made with the publisher was that they would fly out a few of these interlocutors that he had interviewed, so that they could in a sense, like the audiences in the States could hear from them themselves, right? So that's one way that we can sort of bring our research to the grassroots, to the public, to make it more accessible, so that it's not that you're just going into communities, talking with them, and then they never get to see how what they shared with you, how it eventually materializes, the interpretations you make of it, etc. So that's one way I feel. Another way that I think it could be effective would be, teaming up with community organizations, community libraries, archives, and setting up events that could then present the results, to them. So just finding out whichever ways that the people in the communities that you worked with, how would they, and just even at the point of speaking with them, even asking, how would they like to see, the final product, what you end up doing with it? How would they like to hear about it? How would they like to engage that work? And then, taking cues from them as well.
And a lead up to, or a follow-up, I should say, to that, a student in the Q&A tools asked, how has studying history shaped your understanding of your own personal history? A lot of my research has focused on things I've learned about my family's past, so I'd love to hear more about your perspective on how personal history has shaped your research and vice versa.
Okay, so as was mentioned in my bio, I grew up in Dubai. And so we had friends from the Caribbean, we had friends from East Africa. And even as a young person, I was just fascinated, especially with like Creole languages, right? Like how it seemed to me that these were ways that people were, how would I, kind of like expressing themselves in African languages, but in European language. So it was like African languages sort of cloaked in these with European words, if I can put it that way. And I was just really fascinated by that. So Creole languages, which then took me to Creole cultures, like seeing the mixture of African and other cultures. So that really was what informed, I think, my sort of initial projects. So my first, I would say, major research work was my undergraduate thesis, which was on the Crop Over Festival or Crop Over Ritual in Barbados. And so what I was doing there was like looking for Africanisms, or the traces of Africa, so to speak, in Barbadian culture through that ritual. And one reason that that was significant was because Barbadians sort of had this reputation that they were like little Black Englishmen, and that there was nothing really African in their culture, which of course was not the case. So that was one way that my past, like my own personal history, kind of led me into research. And so, but then what I then began to see as I was doing research on sort of African cultural manifestations in the Caribbean and diaspora, I was actually also learning about my own past, because I was seeing things that helped me understand kind of phenomena happening, cultural things in Ghana that, oral traditions perhaps had lost the explanation for. So it was really interesting. So like, for example, with foods, so what did we eat 200 years ago? Well, it's very highly likely that some of the recipes, that have went across the oceans have been preserved. And so there are even ways that you can link or understand, the food history of West Africa through the Caribbean and the African-American cuisine as well. So it's just, my sort of personal history drove me into research in the African diaspora, but then by doing that, I was also sort of exposed to my own past and understanding, who I am today as a Ghanaian woman, the foods that I eat, the songs that we sing, the dances and all of that. I can go on and on about this for a while, so let me stop.
Well, thank you for sharing that piece of your culture and why you decided to pursue research in this area. A student is curious about, how important you think the African diaspora is to African-American culture and history? I mean, obviously you went to school in the United States and you've studied here. So what is your perspective on how the African diaspora influences American culture and history?
Oh, I would say it is extremely so both as an event and as a process. So when we talk about the African diaspora, talking about, the diaspora in terms of the dispersal of Africans, so that event, but then just even the process, it wasn't just something that happened and then that was that. Obviously, these were not inanimate objects that were taken, across the oceans. These were people, and people carried with them, their values and their culture and their, ways of seeing the world and all of that. So obviously that impacted what we know today as African American culture, right? And then also, so there's this concept of the sort of the new African diaspora, or the modern African diaspora, which is like the more recent sort of voluntary, even though we can argue about how voluntary one's migration is, if they're being forced out by economic factors, but that sort of the newer kind of migration from the African continent to the United States or North America in general. That also definitely, because people don't exist in silos, there's definitely, connections and contact that are made. People begin to feed off one another. And especially now in the last, 10, 15 years, social media and all of that is definitely blown up. People, the cultures are really, connecting in ways that we couldn't have seen as possible even 20 years ago. And so like there's continuous influence. The African diaspora continues to have influence on African American culture. So even in music, I think it was like 2 or 3 years ago, Beyonce collaborated with Burna Boy in Nigeria. So it's like we have African American music, hip hop influencing Ghanaian music. So from High Life, we got Hip Life. And then it's sort of now also, going back and in this organic way, there's, this continual back and forth, influencing one another. So yeah, I think that African American culture is certainly, definitely has been influenced by the diaspora, both quote unquote old and new. Yeah.
And what are some of the key findings or insights from your research, specifically on Black archival traditions and memory work, that you want to share? Anything that you want to say about that?
Yeah. So so there are quite a few, but I think I'll just speak to 3 things. That one, especially for archivists and archives in African and the African diaspora, participatory strategies are key, right? They're key to recovering all the registers of the African and African diaspora archive. So let me take one aspect of archiving, for example, what we call description, right? So an archival collection is processed, it's arranged, it's organized, and then we have description, which is basically the archivist describing and synthesizing the contents, what's in the archive. So it then produces finding aids. So the way it's been done traditionally is that it's the archivist who writes this based on their understanding of the material. But I think that, so what I found is that what is more valuable and something that is becoming more common in African-American and African diaspora. So I'm talking about, let's say, Black communities and archives in Britain, for example, where this participatory aspect where it's not just now the archivist who says, okay, this is how I'm going to describe, this is what this photograph is about, or this is what these letters are about, but then actually inviting community feedback and, collaborating with the community, opening it up for people's memories and people's feedback about, the material. So that's one, and that's something that it's not, I can't even say that it's very common in Africa, on the African side. Maybe in Kenya, that's happening a little bit, but that's something certainly what I seek to do here in Ghana is to encourage that more. It's going slowly, but hopefully, that will become more common here. So that's one, that participatory strategies are key to recovering the memories, right, and all the registers of the African archive. Then secondly, that community archives are relevant even in the African context. So community archives developed in the US and in the UK as spaces that were important to minoritized communities, right, where they did not feel like they were represented in the national archives, right? So in the US, you have community archives for example, the South Asian community. In the UK, you have the Black Cultural Archives, which documents mostly the histories of Black Caribbean, but also African immigrants in the UK. So in the African context, it would seem like community archives are not needed. Like, we're all African. What do we need community archives for? But I've discovered that they're actually also vital in the African context, where we do have, let's say, communities that are minoritized in other ways. So it's not based on race, but it's based on ethnicity. It's based on, and even language, like, and there are endangered languages. So when smaller communities find themselves surrounded by maybe larger, more powerful ethnic groups or more influential ethnic groups, they then begin to be, in a sense, overtaken by them. So community archives are actually quite necessary and quite relevant for communities like that. And then that we need for African, for like the full scope of the African and transatlantic African diasporan story, archives in whatever shape, whether the conventional ones, paper sitting in a repository somewhere, or even in unconventional archives. So, embodied archives such as ritual and dance, etc. These are crucial. Like, they're extremely crucial to not only the telling of transatlantic African diasporan histories, but also to the strengthening of African diasporan solidarities, that it is in the archive that often forgotten stories about African and African-American and Afro-Caribbean connections and, struggles are located. And so we need our archives basically to tell our stories and also to strengthen our solidarities. If you would permit me, I'll go back to my first point. I actually just thought of an example to illustrate what I mean by that participatory strategies are key. So a few years ago, I was doing some research and I went to the what's it called again? So our Ministry of Information Services Department photo archives. And so I was doing some research for a project based in the Upper West region of Ghana. And there was this photograph that struck me. It was of this chief. It was just a really striking photo. So I asked, all it had in terms of a label was unknown chief, Nandum, which is the area, 1980s. Like, so I asked, like, does anyone have any idea of who he is? They were like, oh no, we don't have any idea. But I decided to use the photograph anyway so I was doing this participatory project up in the Upper West region. So I used the photograph in the exhibition book. And two people actually identified the chief and had stories about him, you know. So I just thought it really illustrated to me so strongly how we actually need these sorts of participatory community archiving in the African diasporan space, because not only did I get a name, but then I also got, you know, a story about this person as a father, you know, and as a politician, as a you know, as a strong member of the community, which if, you know, I hadn't done that project, I would not have found. So yeah, I just remembered that, and I wanted to use it to illustrate my first point.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I'm curious, in building upon your discussion around community archives, how do you think that translates in the United States? Do you see, is there a lack of community archives? Do you feel like there's a need for them? And what story do you think they will tell in the context of the African diaspora, specifically in the United States?
Okay, well, you know, I think of the Schomburg, so I worked at the Schomburg for a number of years. I actually think of it as a community archive in a sense. But then there are others. In New York, there is a Weeksville Historical Society, which is in Brooklyn. And there are others across the United States in terms of African-American or, you know, or Black, quote unquote, Black archives. So at the Schomburg, for example, it's the, you know, Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. And it's, yeah, we have at the Schomburg, they have materials on African-Americans, on Afro-Caribbeans, Africans, you know, Afro-Latinas and Latinos. So in the States, actually all across, there are different community archives. Actually, so the conventional telling of the story of community archives in the United States actually usually starts with the South Asian Diaspora Archives, which is a digital community archive. And usually when there's discussion in the literature around community archives in the States, that is the archive that's usually used as like the first one. But I feel like actually African-Americans have been documenting and archiving and doing this work for a very long time, because they were excluded from the national story, you know? So Schomburg is a perfect example, but there are others as well.
And so, yeah, so we have a student that is interested in cultural history, and especially in misinformed ideas about the past, specifically perpetuated by the media, politics, and bad history education. What kinds of harmful myths do you have to dismantle in your field? And what do you do to spread the truth to wider audiences?
Yeah. So, you know, what's interesting, and that's an interesting question. So I'm going to talk about it now, like from the historian, the historian point of view, where there was that myth, which has been largely debunked, that Africa has no history, mainly because history is conceived of or conceptualized as what you find in written documents. So if there's nothing written, well, then there's no history there. So that idea has been largely debunked, but you still see it sort of bubbling underneath the surface, and it comes out in different ways. So for me, about a couple of years ago, there was this moment when I was teaching, and it was a master's class, and I'd had the students go into an audiovisual archive and look at, they were free to choose material to look at. And so one of the students had looked at material on these various cultural rights in a particular region in Ghana. So I was kind of familiar with that video, and I knew what it was doing, was talking about the rites of passage, and so we know that these moments, these social moments were spaces in which history was passed on, to those who are now being transitioned into manhood or womanhood. And so I knew that that was what the video was about. But then when she was talking about it, she talked about it in terms that were just, she used words like savage, and I don't think my mouth dropped, but mentally my mouth did. I was just in shock. And thankfully, the other students in the class who kind of took her to task for it. But I was talking about it with a colleague later, and she said, well, what do you expect, actually? Because that's the educational system is actually still kind of perpetuating these ideas. And then also, like, history is not being taught. Like, it's been taken out of the curriculum here. So, like, what do you expect? And so it's like, for me, that was a moment where I thought, okay, no, I have to do something, and so now I'm very sort of conscious about speaking when I'm teaching, like, alerting students to the various ways in which people remember, and that one is not better than the other, and that, I have assignments where I say, go and speak with a grandparent, for example, or any elder in your community about a particular event or something like that, just so that they value the ways that we choose to remember, the different ways that we choose to remember. Also, talking about other cultural documents, like we have many rituals in Ghana that basically will, document or repeat our history, our past. And so, yeah, for me personally, that's how I try and kind of, challenge some of these harmful myths and attitudes to the way, the way people consider history, even our own, history. And so it's, yeah, I'm just thinking about that. It's, it's something that, even though it's a notion that seems to have been debunked, I realize that it's still kind of bubbling underneath the surface, that we have this idea that, we didn't have a history, we didn't have education, because I think that was another point she made, that it was, with colonization, that's when we got education. And I was like, well, what do you understand to be education, So yeah, it was a great teaching moment for me as well. Yeah, but there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. But I think just, it's about patience, because I had to understand that it's not, in a sense, it's not their fault, you know, if that's how you've been sort of, you've been trained to think. It's now going to take some time to unpeel all that. Yeah.
And what inspired you to return to Africa, to Ghana, to teach? So you pursued your education at Spelman for undergrad and then NYU, and you could have chosen to teach in the United States. So what inspired you to return back to Africa to teach?
So it was a mix of factors, some, personal as well. But actually, I only taught, I think, for about a year or so after I got my degree in the States, and then I went into industry, so to speak. I was practicing as an archivist. I was an archival assistant at the NYU archives throughout my grad career. It was a way that I paid the bills, but I also really developed a love for it, and I realized that it was another way that I could help to preserve history, to preserve our history. Another way that I could, like, just do that work of interpreting and understanding the history of Africa and the African diaspora. So so it was a mix of factors, some personal as well. But then when I made the decision to return, I wasn't 100% sure about whether I wanted to teach or whether I wanted to continue to be an archivist here. But then when I came back, I realized that, in a sense, the state of the field here was very much focused. It was more focused on preserving, like, government records, right? So there was a sort of very narrow understanding of what archives are. And so then I realized that I needed to teach, I needed to impact the next generation of archivists that come out of my department. And so, so I applied. I was actually invited to apply, and I did. And it's been a great last few years. There's been definitely challenges, but I'm happy that I'm here. I'm happy that I get to influence the next generation of practitioners and theorists, to think about what we mean when we talk about archives. Is it only government records? What about, what exists in the minds of our grandparents, for example? Are those archives? Like, just to kind of begin to really, poke holes into received understandings of what an archive is, and to just kind of question, the archival heritage that we have, like, in terms of conventional archives, like the National Archives. Why were the National Archives created? They were part of colonialism. The colonial machinery needed these archives to basically to run their colonial project. So, once students begin to see that, they then begin to see how the way, how the National Archives operates, how it may not fully, be fully beneficial or fully incorporate all the ways that we remember, all the ways that we document. And so, what do we do? What do we do now? How do we make it a more inclusive space? So those are the kinds of conversations that we're having, and I'm glad that I'm here to foster them.
Amazing. And so we talked a little bit about, your transition to where you are now, but I want to reflect back a little bit because we have a number of Leadership Alliance students on this
Mhm.
webinar. And so a student wants to know specifically, what did you learn either academically or personally during your time as a Leadership Alliance SR-EIP participant?
Okay. So as you can tell by the fact that I did it 3 times, I really, really loved my experience. I really treasured it, and I learned a lot. I think so academically, I would say that being a participant helped me develop research skills. I think, yeah, I think that was when I first did primary research as a history student. And it was also, it also showed me, how to be, how to think, I guess, or even how to appreciate um, multi and interdisciplinary conversations, So because in the program, at least at the time that I was there, every week we would have a faculty member, a faculty talk, and it would be, someone from sociology or someone from psychology or cultural studies. And so it's as they're talking, at least for me, it forced me to kind of make connections. So how does what I do or what I'm interested in, how does it relate to that field? So just really, I think that's where I began to see the value of interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary work. And then also, listening to my cohort and listening to the projects that they were doing, what they were interested in researching, and then just having that space to hear them, and then also to contribute. Like when it's like, oh, I can actually make a suggestion that is helpful to someone from another discipline. That was a great teaching moment. And then personally, it helped me know what sort of grad program and school I wanted to go to. So I'd always suspected I was a city person, but I think doing the Leadership Alliance Summer Research Program in New York City cemented it for me. It's like, yeah, you're a city person through and through. So I knew that I could not go to a graduate school somewhere in the middle of, I don't know, Oklahoma. I don't know. I've never been to Oklahoma. So if you're from Oklahoma, pardon me. But I'm just saying, like, I just knew that, okay, I'm a city person. And so I need to be in a school that's in a metropolis. And that's where I would thrive. And then just hearing the different faculty stories as they came to talk to us, it was helpful. It was helpful to kind of make this something more reachable. It wasn't something that it was no longer something that was like far off that I couldn't attain. It was like, okay, they're human beings. They have problems, challenges and everything, but they went through it. And so when I went through my own challenges and problems later on, it was like, well, you know what, others have done it. And so can you. And then I think lastly, also, I would say that it just relates to that last point. It helped me prepare for some of the difficulties I could face as a person of color, especially as a woman, because I remember Professor Renee Blake. I just remember her talk very vividly, and she was just very, what do you call it, candid about that. And so it was difficult to hear, but it was like I needed to hear it. And so I would say those were some of the ways. I'm sure there were others, but like just thinking about it now, these were the ways that I think these are the lessons that I think I learned, both personally and academically.
Yes, and as someone who did my graduate degree at NYU, I can attest to the fact that it is a great program, great faculty, although I was on the STEM side, but still. So thank you so much for this conversation. I do want to just close with any parting information or advice that you want to relay to our young scholars who are joining us today, who are either in the process of doing research or thinking about it, anything that you want to say to them specifically.
Okay, sure. So, for those who are both in the program and those who are not, I would encourage you to take full advantage of your mentors and supervisors. So if you're not in the Leadership Alliance program and you're an undergraduate, go talk to your lecturers. Go strike up a conversation. Get to know at least one person. Seek advice. Talk to them about their journeys. Ask questions. I think I was absolutely blessed with a wonderful undergraduate mentor who continues to be a friend. However many years later, we are still in touch. I continue to ask advice from her. So that would be like my one strong piece of advice. Get to know mentors, supervisors. If you're thinking about going into research, ask all the questions. Seek their help. Write your personal statement, or whatever it is that you need to apply for grad school. Run it by them. Another advice I would give, if you were in the program, I don't know if Taiese, is this still the situation where they do conferences at the end of the,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes.
So definitely, definitely participate, present at conferences, network. I was a shy person. I was like, I did not want to talk to anybody, but it's like, okay, I think by the third summer, I was like, okay, you're just gonna have to talk to somebody. Like, find one person you do not know, introduce yourself, ask questions, and then keep in touch with your cohort. If you're in the Leadership Alliance program, I can't tell you how important that is. At least for me, I found that. So my first summer, I became fast friends with one woman she was at Duke at the time. She graduated and then went to Berkeley for graduate school. And so she was a year or two ahead of me. So, I got to hear from her about grad school and all of that. And so that also helped prepare me. And then my third summer, someone in my cohort then, we ended up going to NYU together. We were not in the same program, but we were at NYU at the same time. And it was great to have someone, who I kind of knew already, so it helped me settle in. So yeah, and then if it's your first time doing research, maybe just enjoy it. Like it can be challenging, but it's also very rewarding. And so I would just encourage you to just push on, in a sense, like jump into that deep end, into that research pool and just swim. And then your what do you call it, like the life preserver are your mentors, your supervisors, your friends, your family. I can't tell you how I'm sure I could not have made it through grad school without my family and the support that they provided. And so, yeah, just relationships are important. So whatever that looks like for you, just maintain relationships. It can be a lonely journey, but so there's no need to sort of further isolate yourself. Go out, have fun, but just push through with the research. So yeah.
Well, thank you for all of that insight, for sharing your background with the students I know that there are a number of questions that we didn't necessarily get to. So if you'd like to share your contact information, I'm sure the students will love to chat with you. We have a Google Classroom set up. And I would just like to echo our speaker here for today as far as the research experiences. If you're already doing a research experience, great. The more that you do, as we talked about, the more exposure that you'll have, and it causes you to kind of reflect and think upon what your interests actually are and where your interests lie. So you may think, you have it all figured out, you have your path all charted out, and then you're exposed to a speaker or faculty member that you didn't necessarily think you would be interested in, and things change. So I would encourage you all just to explore different opportunities, to have an open mind. There are a lot of programs now that are interdisciplinary, that cross over between, humanities and STEM or public health, and in the social sciences. So it's definitely something that you should take advantage of if that's something that you're interested in. And also the conferences. So the Leadership Alliance does host a conference at the end of the summer, which is the Leadership Alliance National Symposium. If that's something that you're able to attend, you should definitely do that. There are other conferences in the US, specifically the AfricanAmerican conference, which is the annual biomedical research conference for minoritized sciences and scientists, and that's in the fall. And there's also the SACNAS conference, which is the Society for the Advancement of Native Americans, Hispanics, and Chicanos, and that is also something you can take advantage of. So there are lots of opportunities to present and talk about your research, and the more that you talk about your research, shows the more that you understand your work. So I highly encourage you to take advantage of those opportunities. So I see Dr. Ashie-Nikoi posted her information in the chat. We will make sure, because I know you don't have access to the chat, I'm going to put it into the Q&A tool. Actually, I'm not able to do that either, but I will make sure that it gets into the Google Classroom for you all if you want to follow up. Otherwise, thank you again so much. And we will see you students all again on Wednesday for our Wednesday workshop series. Thank you so much.